My name is Eli Saltzman. I'm a professor of Israel Studies and the director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies at the University of Maryland at College Park. This is our third webinar dedicated to the exploration of various aspects of the Israel-Hamas war. If you have any questions or comments, please use the chat, the Q&A section option, the feature at the bottom, my apologies, of your screen. Please keep your comments short and your questions shorter so the speakers have enough time to address those during the Q&A session of the webinar. Don't forget, a question is a sentence with a question mark at the end, but comments are also welcome. So today's webinar is entitled Teaching About Israel in Time of Conflict. And this is what we'll talk about in the coming hour or so. Many professors have been grappling with the difficult task of teaching their classes about Israel following Hamas's October 7th, 2023 attack and the subsequent Israeli military campaign in the Gaza Strip. Amid rising tensions on campuses across the nation, navigating complex historical, political, and cultural narratives has possibly been more challenging than ever before. This special webinar features lecturers from diverse disciplines who teach in Washington, D.C. and the area, and aims to shed light on how they address these pressing issues in their classrooms and perhaps also on campus all around. But rather than run this kind of as a formal and possibly cumbersome format, we'd like to have more of a conversation here among the three of us. We'd like you to be part of it. So as I said, we will have some guiding questions for us. Our speakers may and are in fact strongly encouraged to relate to each other's comments and remarks so we can have a dynamic and vibrant exchange. But you can nevertheless, as I said, address your questions during our exchange in the Q&A box in the bottom. Don't worry if we don't answer those during our conversation, we will certainly address these later on. So it is my honor to kind of briefly introduce today's two fellow participants or fellow speakers. Alia Dubnov is the Max Tichting Chair of Israel Studies at the George Washington University here in DC. Trained in Israel and in the US, he's a historian of 20th century Jewish and Israeli history. Before he arrived at GW, Dubnov taught at Stanford University and the University of Haifa. And again, we're going to dig slightly deeper into what they do today in a second. Lauren Strauss is senior professorial lecturer in Jewish history at American University in Washington, D.C. She also serves as director of undergrad studies for the Jewish Studies program and is affiliate faculty with American University's Center for Israel Studies. And as I said, this will be kind of more of a conversation with all kinds of questions. And so just so we can get to know each other and understand who's who in this roster, Lauren, can you tell us what is your field of expertise? What is it that you do? What makes you a professor of Israel Studies or something that is adjacent to that? What do you do, my friend? Go ahead.
Thank you, Eli. Thank you for the invitation. Unfortunately, it's very timely. So I'm actually the odd person out here. I won't say the odd man out here on this panel, because I'm not only not a man, but I'm not Israeli, and I'm also not primarily a professor of Israel Studies. I teach general Jewish history and also Jewish culture, a lot of Jewish literature at AU. My background is actually something called modern Jewish studies. It's very interdisciplinary. So I really am an interdisciplinarian when I teach. And I use a lot of, besides sort of traditional history, I also use a lot of art, literature, film, and so on and so forth. And at AU, I teach teach survey courses in both ancient and medieval, and also modern Jewish civilization, modern Jewish literature, et cetera. But my personal research and my area of expertise is American Jewish political and cultural history. That's what I've written on mostly, and working on 2 books on that. And so while I do have a background personally in Israeli history and Israel in general, I also, in my teaching, try to present this through the lens of the American public, the American Jewish public, Israel and diaspora relations, etc. I'm also particularly glad when my students have a variety of backgrounds. Obviously, I can't go around the class and ask people, what their religion is or what their, what their ethnic identity is, but students tend to self-identify. And I think it's a very good sign, and it's a sign of success for our program and for Jewish studies and Israel studies in general, to be seen as an academic discipline among academic disciplines, and to have students of all backgrounds taking it. Having said that, then this year has been particularly challenging, obviously in many ways, but also because students in my classes, and in particular in my History of Israel class, which I'll talk about a little bit later, have had different relationships to and reactions to the events this year.
Absolutely. You mentioned you were working on 2 books, if I'm not mistaken. You said 2 books at the same time. Really,
Yes.
that's amazing. Can you talk about the books, or kind of in a one-liner?
Glutton for punishment. So I'm finishing a long time book on called Painting the Town Red, about a group of radical left-wing Yiddish, mostly Yiddish speaking Jewish artists, visual artists, mostly painters, sculptors, lithographers, etc., in New York in the interwar period. So from the late teens to the late 30s, and the intersection between their involvement in Yiddish culture and in American, mostly left-wing politics, and in the international art world. So that's the book that I've been working on for a long time. And the one that I've started in the last few years is about, it focuses on the political and cultural history of Jews in Washington, D.C., especially in the middle decades of the 20th century. So sort of a transition from the New Deal era, so probably starting around the 1930s and going up until the 1980s, and really exploring how today's DC Jewish community and very politicized American Jewish community became who they are. And the larger question there is then the interaction between American Jews and democracy, and really in a more general sense, even between minority groups in America and democracy.
I got you. Excellent. Ali Dubnov,
Well, good evening,
thank you.
afternoon,
What
everyone.
is your field of expertise? What do you do? What do you research? What are you working on?
First and foremost, thanks for putting this together and inviting me. So a bit my training and perhaps also way of looking at the world, my epistemological glasses, to use a very ugly academic language, is I'm a historian. So I'm interested in questions of continuity and change and so on. Job market dynamics led me to that odd field that is called Israel studies. I think ever since I've joined GW, I've tried to build bridges between kind of Jewish studies on the one hand and Middle Eastern studies on the other hand, and to think about situating Israel studies in that intersection. No pun intended, thinking about the bridge that collapsed in Baltimore a few days ago. Sometimes I feel that building bridges is a much more hazardous action than one thinks. But in terms of my background, I was trained in cultural and intellectual history. So I'm very much interested in the history of political ideas, and the role of intellectuals in political spheres, both in terms of as political actors and as people that generate visions for the future. And I'm also very much interested in seeing Jewish history, modern Jewish history and its political history in conversation and dialogue with British imperial history. So my first book was an intellectual biography of Anglo-Jewish philosopher and intellectual named Isaiah Berlin. So it already, the intersection between these two issues was very clear there. Someone that is regarded on one hand as a Jewish intellectual and a Zionist, on the other hand seen as one of the key Cold War intellectuals, and ever since I've moved to talk about the history of partition politics that I also read as part of a longer British imperial history, and much of what I'm doing, both in teaching and in research, is connected to it. So I was also very lucky to be part of a team of several historians that are launching now a new textbook in Hebrew at the Open University that wants to kind of bring, synthesize a lot of the literature that was produced in the last few decades and kind of brush off the discussions after too many years that our basic textbooks were very much kind of stuck in the literature of 3 or 4 decades ago.
All righty. What do you teach during this year? What classes are you offering this time around?
So usually often I'm trying to follow the script of offering in the fall, basically a history of Zionism for undergraduates. I'm offering a history of Zionism and Jewish nationalism, and I'm putting them both together. So it's kind of a survey that puts it also in a European context and through nationalism context up to 1948, and then in the spring, a class that is, of course, not officially a sequel, but often draws the same crowd, that deals with war and peace in Israeli history, which basically continues that journey from roughly 1948, 47, 48, as much as I can to present.
I got you. So I'm going to ask myself, what do I do? What do I teach? Well, I'm a scholar of international relations, specifically international security. I focus on foreign policy analysis, and I am mostly interested in Israeli foreign security policy and U.S. foreign policy in the context of the Arab-Israeli conflict. And I'm going to pick up on something that Ari just said, the job market. And so for me, in terms of kind of moving from one discipline or one sub-discipline to the other, for me, it was a professor who forced me to write a paper about Israel. I was reluctant to do that. I thought that American foreign policy was much more interesting, much richer, given the global scale and so on and so forth. But I found that it's quite the opposite. It is very rich, and he passed away a couple of years ago, but I dedicated the article that came out from that paper in a sense. And this year, I taught in the fall a class on Israeli politics and society. And now in the spring, I teach a class on Israeli foreign and security policy. And as Lauren, and I think that both you and Lauren said, in a way, it was kind of very timely and extremely relevant. And so some of the conversations we'll have in a moment are transpiring, that are happening inside the classroom as well. Some of the questions that we're struggling with, first certainly during the fall, but certainly also now. It's just to put things in context, because we are professors and we're going to focus on the classroom, but in a couple of sentences, perhaps, just to describe the situation on campus or the atmosphere on campus, because it feeds into the situation inside the classroom, I assume.
Well, I think that sort of I'm very cautious in approaching these type of topics, because there's a lot of media coverage that creates a twisted mirror about all these discussions. So even this phrase, the atmosphere in the classroom, I might come out very, it might sound surprising. My classroom experience this year was phenomenal. The students taking my classes were open-minded, thoughtful, asked excellent questions. They were very much engaged. Now, why do I mention it? Because I think that often we collapse a discussion about the atmosphere in the classroom with bigger questions about campus politics, and it's not the same. And the way in which these things are have their echoes outside campus in the community and so on. So there's like different levels in that respect. And I would say that in my case, at least, it seems to me that the classes themselves are very good academic filters in the following sense. Students come to my classes and then have the horror experience of reading the syllabus. And then they understand that if they're taking the class, they really need to do some work. And it filters out a lot of students that are not ready to do the heavy lifting. So those who are there are committed. They read what I assign and ask questions about it. And usually that's not a problem. That's for me, as a professor, that's wow, give me more of that. That's exactly that sweet spot where encouraging. The questions are about events taking place on campus, outside the classroom, relationship with other colleagues that have expectations that you'll make these statements or other statements, the way in which one needs to build, so to speak, ad hoc panels on campus. So I would put it, maybe later on we can go into details, but that's not the classroom experience. So in a way, it was very important to me. And a few months ago, I found myself in a conversation with a colleague, Shachar Pinsker from University of Michigan, and we wrote an op-ed at Haaretz Literary, the English edition of Haaretz, exactly about kind of trying to put things a bit in a perspective. So yeah, and it's super important to me to be cautious. And I also will push back in a very strong way against fellow academics that make themselves the victims in that moment. I mean, campus politics can be vicious, can be ugly, but at the end of the day, we are not in the war zone. So there's something to be said about people that use this moment to put the attention on themselves, which is a very narcissistic and academic practice that I feel very uncomfortable with.
I got you. Lauren, you want to talk about American University, about the experiences there, perhaps? Ari was kind of pushing back against
Right.
kind of the use of the term atmosphere, but do you have a better term or a different term, or do you want to describe it differently, perhaps?
No, I think he was pushing back against the idea of assuming that the inside the classroom part
sure.
is affected by the atmosphere. First of all, I'm just laughing because as Ari describes the experience for the student of taking his class, because my son went to GW and took 2 classes with Ari. And yeah, he had a lot of work to do, but he signed up for the second one. So that's the good sign. It has not been an easy year, but having said that, strangely for me, my personal experience inside the classroom has been fine. But I will get to the other outside the classroom, inside the campus parts in a minute. I think that in part there's a self-selected group. And I know that, for instance, as I mentioned, I was teaching history of Israel last semester. So in the fall, I know just from things people said to me and their midterms and whatever, that there was far from unanimity in people's students' attitudes about Israel, their relationships to Israel. And they were really on, not, I would say not the whole spectrum, but it was wider than you might imagine among students taking a History of Israel course. I found that people were respectful of me, of the material, of each other. And I also know that I was not okay. And pushing back a little bit about what Ari said at the end, no, we're not there physically, but for me, certainly, and I mean, you guys are Israeli, but for me, a large part of me is there because my daughter is there and is in the army. And there's nothing like knowing that your child is there and had friends killed. I 2 of my children had friends who were murdered. So I actually treasure the comments from some students that I got, sort of, I don't want to say it this way, but sort of complimentary comments saying, I actually never, ever, sort of talked so personally, but so it's not even that they didn't know the extent of it by any means, but people know that we have relationships with Israel, that we professors have personal relationships with Israel, and that this wasn't an abstract discussion in our lives. So that was really nice, and in fact, comments from some of the students who I know have maybe different attitudes toward Israel than I do. So it was not even the normal oddity of being a Jewish studies professor in the world, which is always kind of fraught. But having said that, as I said, the atmosphere in the classroom was really fine and respectful. On October 9th, I taught on Mondays, and so less than 48 hours after everyone heard everything, I was standing there. I had some students who were hysterical crying throughout the class, and I had some students who were kind of like really didn't know what was going on. And they really needed a sort of a class explaining to them what had just happened. So I, kind of course, threw that day's lesson out the window and did, some background explaining. But the atmosphere on campus outside the classroom is different, and I'll get more into that later. But it has to do with freedom of expression, policies, different student organizations and their relationship with each other, different faculty and their relationship with each other. What is academic freedom? Does that mean that faculty can assign anything in the whole world and as part of their syllabus? And it is also very much part of the conversation. What's happening on campuses in general is part of the combination and is part of the conversation happening in US politics, having very little to do with Israel, Gaza, etc. And I will even go further and say that the situation of Israel, Gaza, etc. is being used by politicians, by American politicians and the American public square on both ends of the spectrum, and by people who on both ends of the spectrum really don't care and certainly don't know that much about it, but it is being used as a sort of as a cudgel to press other people's agendas. So a lot of that is happening.
Let me pick up on a couple of things that you said, as well as Ari, and kind of I have other questions, but that's kind of, I think that would be interesting. And again, this is perhaps a sample of three of us in a way. I'm Israeli. I think that Ari is also, but how do you approach Israel studies as a professor who has some kind of a vested interest? It's not necessarily a theoretical or an academic field as such, as if I were to study Liechtenstein or Luxembourg or Brazil or Chad for that matter. How do you frame that? And when I start every semester, my first spiel basically is to say, well, I'm from Israel, born and raised. I will try to do my best, perhaps extra best, to try and keep things as much as I possibly can, both balanced, nuanced. So beyond the knowledge, it's about how do you present, how do you frame the conversations that oftentimes are they're narratived. They have multiple, they're multifaceted. So how do you go about that, given who we are, who you are in that regard, with their different identities or self-declared identities? Ali, you want to pick it up? You want to start with that?
Well, it's a kind of the 12-tongue kind of question, and of course it plays out differently when you talk to undergrads and graduate students. I mean, so I find myself working with graduate students both at the MA level and a PhD level. Some of them are coming from kind of political science approach. Some of them are coming from a more historical approach, and of course a lot of these questions predate October 7. So the production of knowledge about Israel-Palestine was always part of a political struggle. And even the fact that we have an emergence of distinct scholarly fields is of course not exception to that. And so part of it is to talk with the students about the way in which the logic of the conflict replicates itself in the academic division of labor in many ways. Now, where there's a level to which one can do that with different levels of students and so on and so forth. Perhaps for me, scholarly, it makes also perfect sense because so much of what I'm trying to do as a scholar is also to zoom out in the following sense. So I've alluded to the British imperial element. So sort of there are a lot of our narrative-driven approaches, the ones that you alluded to, are not only collapsing into what we academics call methodological nationalism, but also they are very good for me as a historian in writing the history with the elephant in the room. So sort of know as if there's no third party, there are no international forces, there's no, even after 1948, when I'm teaching the Yom Kippur War, we have a long discussion about Cold War politics and proxy wars and the logic of proxy wars. And that's if you look at the war from a perspective of a historian and follow even the military history, and you see Russian MiGs used by Syrian pilots and American Phantoms flown by Israeli pilots, it sheds a different light on how we read these conflicts. So one can do that often with the undergraduate students more through examples and not very abstract and highly dense theoretical discussions. With the graduate students, especially if it's they're working on dissertation and so on, you go to the weeds. It's kind of also who are the sources you're relying on, what are you following a specific paradigm analytically or dogmatically, and so on and so forth. So these are different types, levels of discussions. But the approach should be always, for me, kind of both as a scholar and both as a researcher and as an instructor, kind of the more the merrier, in the sense that, of course, there are voices that are beyond the pale. I would not tolerate calls for violence, but often I think Lauren won't find it completely surprising that sometimes one finds himself in a very awkward position that students are very cautious consumers. So, and to begin with, many of your students are coming assuming that you will give them a very pro-Israeli kind of classic labor Zionist narratives, and even will push back from a conservative point of view. And you find yourself in a position that you find, saying, but if we would have a Palestinian in the room, they would say, ta-tam, 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 ta-tam. Which this is all to say that diversity is a value, not only for, put a nice makeup and show ourselves, flatter ourselves, pat ourselves on the back, but it's really, once you have a diversified student body, it does raise interesting perspective that usually, if you're a good instructor, you navigate them in a productive way that are teaching moments.
Lauren, how do you see that? Do you kind of come up front and say, X, Y, I'm doing this, or part of my identity is this kind, and as a result, some of the conversations kind of become different, or are you approaching this kind of as if dispassionately, unrelated, unattached, and so on?
Well, first of all, you're not going to get out of answering this either. So after we answer, we want to hear from you, Eli. This is the the dual identity of being the moderator and a panelist also. I think that is impossible and it would be dishonest. And so I think two things that sometimes are competing and how they are executed. One is that you have to be honest about who you are. I'm not into oversharing and sharing too many personal details, and I think sometimes that's inappropriate, even though it seems to be the way of our society right now. Let me tell you, I'm not on social media at all. I don't want to be on Facebook. I don't care to see everyone's vacation photos. So I think that there's a lot of that, but you have to be honest, and you guys are pretty obviously Israeli, and I'm sure that that is absolutely the case, Ari, that people will assume certain political positions that you may or may not actually have. It's no secret that I happen to be Jewish, with my hair. I can't really hide that. But one thing that I think is important is not only to be honest about your identity, but also then to say that they need to be honest about conversing with you. And a journalist friend of mine just last week was talking about one of her editors years ago at the Washington Post. And this editor insisted that they never ever write a story. This should be obvious, but it's not, that they never write a story based on other people's headlines and even based on other people's reporting, that they need to go back to the source. We were talking about the sort of explosive effect of Chuck Schumer's recent speech. And I realized, I started asking people who were commenting on it and showing great umbrage at what they thought he had said, that absolutely no one, I asked, had actually read or heard the speech. They were all commenting on the headlines and the one pull quote, which was a doozy. And so to get back to what I know Ari does so well, going back to the sources is really important. So on the one hand, you're standing there saying, yeah, this is who I am. On the other hand, you're providing them with the tools to then make those decisions or come to those conclusions on their own. The other thing I'll say about it that's so ironic about this year, and I think probably a lot of people had this whiplash, is that until October 7th, what was the big story in Israel was the democracy movement. And I think I'm not probably out of line to suggest that many, if not most, professors and academics were kind of on the side of the democracy movement. And then a lot of people sort of went into a defensive posture after October 7th and went from planning a syllabus that was frankly critical of a lot of recent developments in Israel to being very protective of Israel. So that was something that I think a lot of people were navigating and still are.
I got you. So yes, I'm not going to hide. I actually, despite the asymmetry of power inside the classroom between the professor and the students, I encourage, in fact, I kind of force the students to keep me in check. And I do that by kind of allowing for a very free, open conversation as much as possible. Again, albeit in light of this power asymmetry, but I do something else that I think that both you, Lauren, and Ari do, apparently, and it is to go to the sources. I'm not a historian by training, but I appreciate very much primary sources nevertheless. And so I try every time to have at least one source that is primary that we can look at and see what people wrote about, what did they say, what did they think. So I'll give you an example. In my Israeli Politics and Society, rather than provide students with a kind of the classical dictionary definition of what Zionism is, I tell them, let's read Herzl together. Let's read Nodau. Let's read Pinsker, and so on and so forth. Hadam. And by the end of that meeting, by the end of the week, I asked them, okay, so what does it mean? What's the common thread? And what is difference? What is the difference? What is different among themselves? So rather than feed them into perhaps what might be my interpretation of Zionism as a scholar, perhaps as an Israeli voter in a sense, as a political actor as well, I allow them to find their route, their pathway forward. So this leads me to another question, and we'll talk about the conflict specifically in a moment. But very briefly, can you talk about the necessary kind of the importance of background knowledge, in your opinion, to have a kind of a meaningful conversation about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, about Israeli-Arab relations, about Israel in the Middle East? How do you struggle with that, if at all, and how do you solve that, if at all? Ali, if you don't mind going first, that'd be awesome.
No, these are, and I love both you and Lauren's comments. I think that there's a few things that are coming together here. And perhaps I see also that one of the questions coming from Lynn Jordan is about media outlets. So sort of there's one level that has to do with positionality, right? How we, we shouldn't create an instance in which we perhaps, what characterizes a scholar of our age, whether you like it or not, is that we are not talking off pedestal as I am objectivity. I am not spirit on off cathedra. Now, this is Hegel 19th century. This is not the American professor in the 21st century, right? We have a skin in the game for good and for bad. But the said sort of a lot of it is about saying my identity is not reduced to one component. And that's kind of so part of what makes things dicey, and it's very much echoes some of the things, but perhaps Lauren, you alluded to, is that a lot of it is that we are in an age that identities are solidified. People want to put you in a very specific box, and so on and so forth. So in a way, part of the conversation should be about how do I, the classroom is a place in which I say, maybe my identity as a historian comes even before my identity as an Israeli. It's more important for me, to be honest. And what is kind of going on here, and there are like other layers of identity and how people deal with that. And media outlets are, in a way, something that is tied to that as well, because media outlets often reflect very specific identity groups, and so for good and for bad. What can we just pretend that it's not there? Perhaps not. If they generate a good question, I think it's gonna, our role as good professors to use even an awkward, very hyperbolic, very partial assessment. Hey, professor, I read on X website, and you're trying not to roll your eyes, this and that, and then nuance it, problematize it, scrutinize it. So sort of I think that's easier said than done, but that's kind of a part of our challenge. So I kind of probably I'm kind of skipping away from your main question. So refresh my memory.
No, it was about knowledge. Do you require prior knowledge in your classes? Is it
right.
necessary? How do you go about if there's a significant gap between what we know as professors, as professionals, and what the students come to the table with?
Sure.
How can you have a decent, kind of a quote unquote decent conversation that is meaningful given
Absolutely.
this imbalance, so to speak?
Oh, no. So prior knowledge is a double-edged sword in the following sense, that it can easily, we want people, and when Forward came to, a reporter from Forward came to interview scholars, I kind of use that pun already, sort of we want students to have question marks, just like your comment at the beginning, rather than exclamation marks. So a lot of students are coming with very solidified, strong opinions. Usually these are slogans. Usually it can be summarized in a hashtag, if not, or maximum a tweet. But they don't want the knowledge. Now, at the same time, if I'm as a professor saying, I'm not listening to you because you haven't spent 30 years studying the languages and traveling to archives and attending conferences, you're actually censoring, you're silencing. So I think the idea is to give them the taste for, right, you go beyond the slogan, read the source. So for instance, sometimes I will bring a tiny item in Hebrew, I will translate a couple of sentences and hoping that it would whet their appetite, and then someone will take upon themselves the daunting task of learning the language that opens up the door to much more knowledge. So I think that kind of, again, we are talking about undergraduate. Graduate level is a completely different ballgame. So yes, I want prior knowledge to a degree. I would be even bold and say that in some cases, prior knowledge backfires. So especially when you have students that came sometimes from very strong Jewish education background, that I feel as if they were fed the Jewish Agency version of Zionism, textbook version 1972. And they have very strong opinions, and they think that they have the prior knowledge, and therefore their version is the right one. And sometimes it's much, much easier, and it's much more productive conversation with those who are coming without any prior knowledge, that you start by putting Israel on the map, saying the scale, the area, the demographic composition, and so on.
I got you. Lauren, what do you think? What is pre-existing knowledge an obstacle? Is it a jumping board? Is it something you can work with? Is it Play-Doh? What is it?
In a larger sense, actually, it is often a problem in Jewish studies at large, not just Israel studies. And it's certainly not always, but sometimes, not infrequently, I've had the case of a student who, comes from Jewish day school or something like that, who either has pretty solidified opinions if it's about politics, or sometimes uses it as a shortcut and thinks that they cannot do the reading and they know all this. They learn that they can't. But I do think that there are I don't know, not preordained, but preformed political opinions, and also knowledge, especially among people who have some knowledge, right? If you have no idea where Israel is on the map, then in a sense it's easier. And frankly, it's often shocking for people who did have some knowledge and thought they knew. A lot of people who know something about Israel's history or the wars or have some Hebrew still don't realize, have no idea what the population is, and don't realize what the demographics. And one thing that I am very involved with, as both of you know, in the Washington area is educating the Washington area community about what we call the 21%, which is the 21% of Israel's citizens who are either self-defined as Palestinian Israelis or Arab Israelis or Israeli Arabs. A lot of people who have been to Israel 10 times have their minds blown when you tell them that more than a fifth of Israeli citizens, not the Palestinians on the West Bank and Gaza, are Arabs, Christian and Muslim Arabs. So there are still things that they don't know. Having said that, though, it is really challenging because you can't do everything, and we want to do so much. So it's not a case where you're just sort of feeding someone basic, okay, this is when Zionism started, and then the waves of Aliyah, and then 1948, and then the wars, and even explaining all of that from the most basic, in the most basic way, takes up a lot of time. But then we really want to go deeper and challenge the assumptions of people who knew a little bit, and also give some kind of tools for assessment to people who did know and who didn't know. It's one of the strange cases, by the way, where most people will walk in knowing or thinking they know something, You know, if you're taking a class about Mali or Burundi, you know, a lot of people are going to walk in and have no idea about anything. But Israel, they've heard something. So it's really, really challenging just in a logistical sense. And I personally don't like boiling it down to the wars. I really don't want to teach the history of Israel as purely 48, 56, you know, 67, 73, and that's it. So as I said at the beginning, I really spend a lot of time trying to work in examples of songs. I talk a lot about language. I talk a lot about personal backgrounds of national ethnic backgrounds of people in Israel, making the point, first explaining what is a Mizrahi Jew? You know, what does that term mean? And you know, what are the various countries people are from? And so you know, what is the food like? And that's really important, because to have a relationship with this country and understand it, you need to know that it's not just the history of its wars. Another thing just sort of relates to our prior discussion about going back to the sources, and about, you know, being honest about kind of who we are. I always, in any class, not just this, I remind students that history is written by humans. It's well, soon it'll be written by chat bots or whatever, but at the moment, still, the secondary sources are all written by people who themselves have personal relationships with the subject matter. And sometimes that evolves over time, and you can read the work of someone, and then 20 years later, the work by the same person. I'm thinking, of course, of Benny Morris, somebody like that, and they themselves have experienced an evolution. And so what you're getting when you read is again never, you know, sort of straight narrative of, quote, what happened. It's also being filtered through the personal stance of the person, and there's nothing wrong with that, again, as long as you're upfront about it. And that's why it's important to include different voices, Palestinian historians or historians of Palestinian narrative. They don't have to be themselves Palestinian. Personal memoirs, excerpts from memoirs. There's some really good collections out now that so just being aware, you're never going to have a completely sort of pure source or person speaking about it. But that's why it's important to, as Ari said, have a diversity of sources, and also just being upfront about this one is coming to you from this type of person and this one. So
kind of the honest, fair, and upfront
sort of all you
framing
can
of that.
do, right?
Just a quote that I remember from Claremont McKenna College, where I taught, was next to the fountain, there was a quote from Churchill: "History will be kind to me, for I intend to write it." So this is just to frame that. All righty,
so he
let's.
did in 6 volumes. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, and he wrote extensively about it.
Right, he wrote 4-volume history.
Just to explain how his history is our history in a way, or somebody's. So let me take it kind of put back the conflict at the center. October 7th happened on a Saturday morning. I taught on Monday. That was the first meeting of the day, and I had a kind of a pre-scheduled. I taught a class in the fall on Israeli politics and society, and between these two sections, I do kind of a one meeting that revolves around Israeli foreign and security policy. And so this happens on a Saturday. I'm being bombarded by students over the weekend about whether we will talk about that on Monday's class. Obviously, the response was absolutely. We can't ignore that, and we'll certainly address that. And so whether I want it or not, it kind of moved in and kind of penetrated the dynamics in the classroom, with people sharing all kinds of stories. One student who kind of stood up and said, one of my best friends was taken captive into the Gaza Strip, for example. We don't know what's going on there. We don't know what's their status. So if you can share something about that day, if it changed the way that you engage the students, the way you perhaps you changed the syllabus altogether. You had something lined up, and then all of a sudden you said, it's out the window. It doesn't make any sense. Let's, reshuffle the whole thing, or let's reframe the whole conversation. Ali, if you don't mind going first, that'd be great.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a very traumatic memory from the October 7th and the immediate aftermath, and it's kind of a sense of shock, and you're focused, with all due respect to the syllabus, on making sure that your dear ones survive. Sort of again, to put things in perspective. The experience that you described on campus is actually a positive one, in the sense that, I also heard students expressing, either very explicitly or in a hintful way, that they need some sort of a space to discuss this. So together with my colleague, Professor Orion Zakai, who's running the Hebrew program, so we haphazardly asked for a room, and it was really, I can't remember the exact phrasing we used in the email inviting students to join, but it was kind of a place to even mourn together, like simply to filter feelings and so on, not to start a political speech making. I will mention that even that gesture had a pushback, and surprisingly, some of the pushback came from American Jewish colleagues, actually. And and a lot of what made the immediate aftermath of the October 7th very challenging for me is the feeling of being very much alone. Sort of I with colleagues from our Institute of Middle Eastern Studies, we put up a panel with experts and did the academic work of bringing diverse opinions. The pushback that came from the Jewish community and from the some American Jewish colleagues was quite shocking, to be honest. And the feeling was that there's kind of an ungrateful position, which I'm the person often students are coming to, me and and another Israeli colleague who's teaching Hebrew, when they want to talk about this. We, on a personal level, colleagues that are not in the field and not Jewish expressed sympathy, even that one sentence, are you okay and the family is okay? And I wish that would have been the case with 90% of the American Jewish colleagues. No, that was definitely not the case. So probably it was also their sense of shock. But I didn't feel that was the case. And in a way, a lot of what makes the conversation super dicey today and very uncomfortable today, especially if you look at the media and the mainstream North American media, is that 90% of the articles that supposedly are talking about the situation in Gaza Strip and Israel are actually American Jews talking about their own feelings. What is my thought about it? How do I get to it? And so there is a feeling for me as an Israeli of, to quote a famous line from a Machina song, everyone is talking about me, but not with me. And that's a very uncomfortable situation. And I can't say that I'll put the blame only on colleagues that are pro-Palestinian and from the Middle Eastern studies arena. It applies very much so on American Jewish colleagues. So in a way, it also shows something about both the situation of Israeli diaspora in the area, but also the academic division of labor, in which Israel studies not only didn't find a home in Middle Eastern studies, I think it never found a home in Jewish studies as well.
That is very interesting. Lauren, what's your take? Did October 7th change the way you teach your classes, the way you approach the topics? Did you change the topics? Did you pivot away into something else? Did you frame it differently? How did it impact the actual conversations inside the classroom?
Well, that day, October 9th, that Monday, and really the next 3 weeks or something, when I think we were all zombies, was, of course, it affected the conversation. As I already said, it was, I threw out the window, you know, what I was going to talk about that day, and tried to explain to the class the history of Israel and the Gaza Strip, and the you know, the withdrawal in 2005, and then the birth of Hamas in 1990 and 1988, and some of those basics. But one of the hardest things always about being a Jewish studies and also Israel studies, so I wear these two hats, professor, and also being someone who is Jewish and very involved in Israel, and it's a very big part of my life, is that we as academics are supposed to be, and should be in general, as professional as possible, as dispassionate as possible, while still being passionate, and consulting the sources, etc. But you know, we're also human, and this has been a very active conversation within the general field of Jewish studies, especially Jewish history, for decades, really. To what extent are people meant to sort of separate their identities, and you know, is it necessary to hide? It's well known on my campus, among anyone who's ever had a course with me, that I make a little speech at the beginning of every semester, and I constantly remind them throughout the semester that we do not use personal pronouns in my class when we talk about Jews. Absolutely, I will stop someone in mid-sentence if they say, you know, well, our history, and I sort of feign ignorance and say, whose history? I'm sorry, I don't know who you're talking about. Because it's really, really important, partly so that they can approach this as an academic, you know, intellectual exercise, and also partly from a perspective of inclusivity, because the last thing that I would want is to be sitting in a classroom and feel like everyone else in this class belongs to the same sort of small group and community, and I'm the only one who doesn't. So there are a lot of reasons to not do that. Having said that, though, it's disingenuous and slightly ridiculous to pretend that you don't have feelings. So you know, so both of those things are there. What I did after that initial day of sort of explaining what happened is I did go back to my syllabus as planned, and I did incorporate, you know, a variety of voices, but one thing that I want to say that didn't so much actually affect my history of Israel class, but that affected the other classes that I was teaching then and I'm teaching now, is that the other classes I'm teaching this semester include survey of modern Jewish history, or modern Jewish civilization, including you know, Eastern Europe and pogroms, and obviously the Holocaust, but also the birth of Zionism and State of Israel. A survey course in modern Jewish literature, including pre-state, you know, Hebrew literature, the Yishuv, and then post, but also Eastern European, Yiddish, all in translation, and the American immigrant experience. And of course, right now, in the relationship between Blacks and Jews in America. And that also, the discussion of Israel really does play a role in that, both in terms of, you know, sort of the traditional, although now challenged, narrative of this beautiful alliance in the early 60s in the civil rights movement, and then what happened after 67, and this what used to be termed the breakup of this alliance, but as I said, that's being challenged, and in certain ways, and what's happening in the last few years between the Black and Jewish communities. So it really, in a sense, the course that it affected the least, in a way, was my course on history of Israel. And so in that sense, I want to respond to Ari's very heartfelt and legitimate sort of complaint about feeling abandoned. And I think that that's true with a lot of my colleagues. It really depends on the campus you're on. But American Jews responding by talking about themselves is, on one hand, self-referential and narcissistic. But on the other hand, it's totally legitimate because of the astronomical rise in anti-Semitism against Jews in the diaspora as a result of the war, et cetera. So it's not that they are sort of imagining that this is affecting them. It is affecting them. So it depends always on, obviously, on how it's framed. But it, you know, and there is perhaps an untoward emphasis on, you know, me, and et cetera. But you know, there is, unfortunately, there are a lot of connections there, and will continue to be. And one of the courses that I taught last spring is, and I don't know of any other course in the country that is about this, is a course called American Jews and Israel, A Complicated Relationship. And I will be teaching that again next spring, but I'll give credit to my colleague Michael Brenner, who's, I think, somewhere out there on the webinar, and is the director of our Center for Israel Studies at AU, which also has really given me a great support. You know, from we have a lovely and wonderful group of, you know, 6 or 8 colleagues who email each other, et cetera. So I haven't felt lonely in that way. But Michael Brenner was able to orchestrate a joint course next spring between the American University and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem on the subject of America, American Jews, and Israel, and the relationship. And we will, hopefully, the plan is to have a group of our students go to Israel for a week, and a group of the Israeli students coming here for a week. So all of that is to say that it really depends on what subject you're teaching about and what campus you're on. And I've learned that there's a humongous spectrum of experiences depending on what campus you're on. And Eli, I'd love to hear what it's like to be at University of Maryland.
Yeah, but so first of all, I'm going to say that we had a former colleague of ours, Scott Lasensi, who used to teach a class on the American Jewish community in Israel. Sadly or not, he went back to U.S. government. So
right. Scott's class, we shared syllabi. Scott's class was more diplomatic.
Yeah, sure. But it's kind of adjacent. And one shout out to Michael Brenner, who's going to be not on campus, but he's going to give a talk for us on April 1st for the Jewish Studies program. End of Laughter, Back to Tears, Modern Jewish Historiography Revisited. So just a shout out to that. And I think that you're right. I think that some of the conversations that we have here are a function of the nature of the community that we have within the Israel Studies department or programs for the most part. It's not just about us and the students. There's a community that needs to come together and support us in providing some backing and enable this idea of sharing. And yeah, we have a very diverse faculty here. We share some of the people. Moad El-Sana, for example, is somebody who teaches at the American University, and we're lucky to have here. And so, it's not just that the disciplines are different. And this is something that I try to think about when I think about Israel studies, that it's not just about the study of Israel per se, but also about the different angles and the context and the comparative dimension to it. Because I think that, again, it is fine, it is awesome to focus on Israel, but there's something else that can be said when you compare it to other cases. What is an ethnic democracy? Is it a unique case in Israel? What are the relationships between Jews and non-Jews different religious groups and tensions and so on and so forth. So I find that kind of this diversity kind of helps to mitigate perhaps some of these conversations that Ari was talking about. But certainly it's about a community as well. So let me kind of very briefly perhaps. So we're talking about the conflict. We're talking about October 7th. It's an ongoing thing. It is certainly part of the conversations that we still have in our classrooms. I start my class always with a current event review kind of a thing. So students come with all kinds of pieces of information, and then we have conversation. And I still try to maintain kind of my loyalty to the syllabus while also addressing current events in that regard. So moving forward, kind of looking into the future, Ari, what does your academic year 24-25 look like? Do you change something? Do you offer a new class? Do you plan on teaching your classes differently based on insights, experiences, traumas perhaps that you've had over the past 6 months or so?
Well, a lot of the decisions about classes and so on are not necessarily only what are my desires, but also how the echelons upstairs want us to teach certain things. And I mean, if I would have been in a perfect world, I would emphasize the importance of co-teaching. I always say every time the best classes I remember taking as a grad students that are with me to this day are the classes that were co-taught by two professors, and even better when they didn't agree on something and it was a great debate in the class. And this is, if you think about now in my advanced age, if I need to remember what I pick up from school, these are like moments. And of course the the higher echelons are looking at me as if I'm crazy, co-teaching, no, funding wise, they will never do that. So there's a limit to what we can do that is not only about, the syllabus and so on and so forth. I think that more and more the emphasis, it continues to be on professional and methodological issues, exactly because this is such a fraught issue and will continue becoming a fraught issue, and on continuing on having conversations across the board. So it's very natural for us, for good reasons, to automatically gravitate towards the Israeli American, Jewish American kind of access. Of course, we cannot ignore this. But that's for me also only a very kind of a small part of that bigger equation. So so yes, so some of the classes I'll be teaching are also graduate classes that some of them draw on my books and on partition politics and so on. So it alludes to your very I agree very much with your kind of a push on moving us outside the exceptionalism box, right? So to see issues, even fraught issues such as ethnic cleansing, partition, transfer, in a comparative or historically evolutionary perspective that is not only in a localized version. So again, it's easier to do it on a graduate level, but that's part of what I'll be trying to do in the next academic year.
Excellent, fantastic. Lauren, does October 7th change your catalog of courses, or notwithstanding the fact that some of it has been already predetermined or it's already set in stone, so to speak, it's in the catalog, but
yeah, these things happen very, very early. People don't realize how far in advance you have to decide what your courses are going to be. But yes, but in a different way, actually. Not so much in the curriculum per se, although it might with one class. Next year, next academic year, I'm teaching, one of the courses that I'm teaching in the fall is an old new course called Jews in the American Political Tradition. I very purposely don't call it Jews in American politics, because it's not about, capital P politics, how many Jews are in Congress or whatever. Like, it's like maybe one session. It is, as I said at the beginning, about the new book I'm starting. I'm really fascinated by the interaction between Jews and ideas of democracy, and also what it means to be a minority in America. And so Jews have had an interesting relationship with sort of the democratic idea. And one thing that I'm not doing in that class so much, but that I do in my modern Jewish civilization class now, is constantly try to point out to them how different democracies, not just other systems of government, envision and frame certain basic concepts like freedom of expression. People just assume that Americans tend to do this, assume that our way is the only way, and that the First Amendment is the only way to engage with freedom of expression, whereas it's envisioned and enshrined very differently in the legal codes of other countries, et cetera. So I think that the current moment will inform my course in American Jews and the American political tradition by talking about those concepts, not so much, not at all, really, Israel, October 7th, but sort of auxiliary issues that I've been dealing with. I said earlier, inside the classroom and outside the classroom have been very different, experiences for me. And so it's those outside the classroom issues that I think will inform part of that course in particular. And that is this whole debate and discussion about freedom of expression and expressive conduct. What does it mean? What is hate speech? What is permissible on a campus? Is a campus, especially in a private university, which does have federal funding, but has a different relationship to the state than, for instance, University of Maryland? What is the role of freedom of expression there? It's not the same. The First Amendment, which is news to most people, does not formally apply to private spaces unless they voluntarily take it on. And whereas other federal laws and statutes do apply, most famously now Title VI. And so, so what does that mean, not only for the present moment, but these are issues that people, especially Americans, but others, have to think about in general. What does it mean to have to sit and hear views that you find obnoxious or hateful? It's usually, and as I already said before, certain things are beyond the pale, to use a very Jewishly oriented expression. But in general, that's what we're supposed to be doing. So in that course, for instance, I will be talking about the famous case in 1977 to 79 of the Nazis marching in Skokie. I discussed that for many years, and how, in light of our current moment, are people going to feel about that, and and things like that. So it will inform that, I think, a lot. And obviously this course that I talked about before on American Jews in Israel. And the last thing I'll say is on this is that it really profoundly affects people who are navigating this strange position of being professors, being academics, and also being on campuses and being, as Ari said before, the person that students go to. And so I had an experience I was at the conference in December of the Association for Jewish Studies, which is a sort of umbrella organization of Jewish studies. And at this conference, I spoke on a panel that was something that we haven't even mentioned today, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion offices on campus, and what's the relationship between those and anti-Semitism or pushback, and of course post October 7th. And what I found at this conference was that it was cathartic for people to be there, because this was a gathering in December, so only, you know, a couple months later, of people who, on the one hand, are being asked to inform and explain and educate not only their students, but also the public, all of us being called by the press to comment on things, etc. And having that weight, that responsibility of explaining things, but also being academics and trying to have some kind of academic intellectual remove, and also dealing with this just onslaught of often hate speech, etc., on campus, and also the reaction against it that sometimes inspires people in the American Jewish community and elsewhere to lash out at those who might disagree with them. And there's just so much complexity there. And so it's exhausting, really. I'm looking forward to the summer personally.
Absolutely. I think we are all kind of fatigued in a way. Alrighty, let's it's 7:19. Let's switch gears and kind of move to the Q&A session with your permission, my friends. One question is, where do you think most students get their news of current events? And are they able to identify subjective versus objective coverage? I think that Ali kind of came out against this idea of objectivity or subjectivity in a sense, but can we talk about reputable outlets that are more, that are better, that are of better quality or not, that students can or should go to? And it kind of ties into another question: what are some of these reliable sources? If you have kind of a go-to place that you oftentimes tell students, this is a good place to start at, if you want to share that. Ali, go ahead, my friend.
Well, I think it became a national sport to bash media, and there are journalists and media outlets that are doing a very, in hard conditions, as much as possible, decent work. So no one is perfect, but let's say this morning I had a 90-minute long talk with a fact checker from the New York Times. Chapeau. So yes, the New York Times and the big media outlets, they're not perfect. They're not fail immune. You have sometimes, but the major outlets that are still believe in the value of journalism and investigative journalism, they're sending reporters to the ground. I would definitely won't rely on them exclusively, but I would not ignore what's going on there for sure, as much as one can do. At the same time, a lot of the conversation with the students is also what, of course, my media diet every morning also includes Haaretz and the Israeli newspapers. And a lot of the conversations is not about objective, not objective, but how you frame things. And who's the audience, right? So that these are news that are for domestic, aimed for the internal consumption. And yes, I am following Al Jazeera as well, as much as people want to see it as outside the pale. Sometimes a very it's not a good exercise for your morning coffee. It definitely ruins your appetite to go through all these different media outlets and channels, but you do have interesting, let's call it Rashomon moments, that you'll have exactly the same footage, right, from the same angle, but suddenly you see how different outlets are using a different caption and they phrase it differently. And if you can do that and do that compare and contrast, it's actually a very illuminating exercise. So yeah.
Lauren, any thoughts? Do you have a different diet of resources, of sources, news or otherwise?
I probably read more of the English language news, but I definitely do. But I think that it's important, not only for this issue, but in general, to try to get a variety within certain bounds. So for instance, in American news stories, it's enlightening to see how CNN and Fox both cover certain things, and then sometimes I just can't watch. But I read both the New York Times and the Washington Post every day. I look at Haaretz English edition, and I've been reading the Forward every day and JTA. I find some of the articles better than others, but I think that they are that the opinion pieces are sometimes really profound by certain people. I have my favorites. And there was just yesterday, I think, a piece by Jody Rudorin, the editor-in-chief of the Forward, and she's written some extremely thoughtful pieces, and some that I don't agree with. But she was talking about this very subject, about sort of like the diet of media that people are exposed to, and it's in the context of talking about a hostage, an Israeli hostage. She was personally following his story and carrying his picture around, and then finding out the other day that he had actually been killed and his body still being held in Gaza, and talking about the fact that she knows his name, she met with his family, and then when she hears the stories about the Gaza population, she doesn't know any of their names for the most part. And what does that do to somebody? How does it depersonalize the effects of, especially a dead child? What does that do to people? And so one thing that I've really become aware of is the difference in just media exposure in Israel and in Israel, and I think to people in the Arab world, and especially among Palestinians, that they are really being exposed to much, to a much shorter spectrum of sources and opinions than we are here. So I think that it's good to get a diversity of opinions within reason, and just to acknowledge that you're not hearing it all, and to take a step back and also remind people, and this is going to make some people angry, that you're not denying the veracity or the validity of a certain narrative or a certain group's story by acknowledging that the other side or the other group also has those stories. It's just, that we're all human. and that somehow is a controversial statement.
It is in some quarters, certainly. I would just mention that my diet is both in Hebrew and in English. I kind of, even before I wake up, I start reviewing the Israeli news sites. But I also like Al Monito. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. It's a very good website because it provides a regional perspective on things that are happening in the Middle East and beyond. And it is written by people, by journalists who come from all quarters, from all around the Middle East. So you'll have an Israeli speaking or writing about Israeli affairs, and multiple Israelis, that is, and Lebanese, and people from Jordan, and people from Egypt, and the Gulf states, and so on and so forth. So it brings together, in a more holistic, if you like, a very diverse way, different perspectives on the same event oftentimes. We had an event, a webinar a couple of weeks ago, and it was about the media and the conflict, and one of the speakers said, paywalls are indications of quality, because as Ari said, to hire a fact checker, that necessitates significant amount of resources, financial resources. And if it's free, oftentimes they can't do that. And that might have something to say about the quality of the reporting, of the coverage of this phenomena, as well as some other things, of course, domestic politics here in the United States, financial affairs, technology, and so on and so forth, with all the the interests that kind of intersect and cross between industries, politics, and so on and so forth. There's a question here. I'll read it for the audience. I appreciate what you said. I think this is about Ari's comment. If a Palestinian were here, he might have said something to the effect of, different people would have taught the class different or framed the conversation differently. This is what I think you talked about in the co-teaching element. My only concern is that at times those back and forth narrative perspectives get elevated, and when without the absolute study of primary sources allows students to sympathize with a particular narrative as opposed to recognizing how that might differ from actual facts. What are your thoughts about this? Is too diverse means too indoctrinating in a sense?
No, so I think it's a very thoughtful question, and I empathize with it. So I'll plug in an article I wrote with my Israel-Palestinian colleague Basma Fahum that appeared in the American Historical Review, that does the academic work of showing why is it challenging and problematic. There's a part of what is endemic problem in the field in terms of the scholarly output, which is connected to asymmetry not only in power, but asymmetry in terms of documentation. So part of what we see that becomes extremely poisonous in discussions is not simply the idea that, okay, let's bring two narratives side by side, and then it's also a very imperfect exercise because of the imbalance of power, but also who has the access to the documents and who has the documents to write about this issue. So the professional historians are grappling with these issues for years now, and one of the mechanisms of silencing Palestinian voices is to say, you have no records, therefore it did not happen. And it can go into a very kind of quasi-Orientalist element in which you have a very imaginative, a fantastic view of the history, and therefore, so it goes back to questions of methodology. So we have a very, I think, thoughtful piece about methodology that brings the imbalance into the field. And part of the problem is how by Israeli historians saying, I have facts, you, the Palestinian, have only opinions, they are creating mechanisms that are extremely problematic that we need to step back away from and think in a more sophisticated way. So the long answer would be, unfortunately, read my article.
Nice plug-in. Lauren, how do you see different narratives, different frames, different methodologies, perhaps now? We went to the kind of the archival argument. If it's not written, it doesn't exist, it's not there.
Well, right. Well, to just respond, two responses to Ari, you're not wrong, but it's also not necessarily always due to like an evil plot or Orientalism or something like that. There are two real obstacles often to doing this. One is that we're teaching this in America, and until recently, I have found personally that many things from that are from a mainstream perspective, if you will, aren't translated into English. So even if the documents exist, I found this actually also with my modern Jewish literature class. Sorry, my dog just decided to come in. I wanted to include more literature from Sephardic and Mizrahi authors, and until recently, there really weren't a lot of works translated into English, and you need that to teach in America. So that is maybe a plea for just the academic world at large to really make that a priority. So that's one thing. But also one really painful aspect of this year, which will hopefully improve, and this is something that Michael Brenner and I were just talking about, is that you need to build bridges that these other perspectives, that hearing Palestinian voices or other voices from other communities it's not only an Israeli-Palestinian issue, need to have people who are experts in those fields speaking to each other. And right now, in a lot of cases, people are refusing to do events with Jewish studies scholars and Israel studies scholars. And so, that is a problem. We have had, as I mentioned before, we have the Center for Israel Studies at AU. There's some movement now. It's a little bit better there's an event coming up that's going to be not co-sponsored, but actually planning an event with Islamic and Middle Eastern studies. But we've had a lot of silence. We've had people pull out at the last minute. And so, it's easy to say you need diverse perspectives, but from my experience, I think that has been really challenging, and hopefully that'll get better. And that's partly a function also of a larger narrative of decolonial studies, and we don't have time to talk about it now, but a certain perspective about Israel that complicates the idea of building academic alliances and co-teaching.
Yeah, absolutely. Very important. Alrighty, we're 7:34. We're almost out of time. So just, in a sentence, one of the questions was, are you offering any classes online for the community at large? Is the university an ivory tower that is enclosed by invisible walls or something? Are you offering anything that is online, Ali, at GW?
The university is not an ivory tower, but it's definitely a corporate machine that wants to create money. So they're welcome to, people from the community are welcome to take classes, sadly, for money. So sort of there is a mechanism for auditing classes and so on. And every once in a while, I do have that experience. The secret I will share with people here is that we might remember, we now forget, there was COVID. So during COVID, I did have to put some of my lectures online on YouTube. And guess what? I did not remove them. So you're more than welcome to find me there. But it's not, of course, the full gamut, and it's very impartial. But I'm very happy to come and speak with, members of communities in different capacities and so on and so forth.
Lauren, how's the center at American University? Is it offering anything online for the community or not?
I was going to say, like Ari, like you, everywhere, universities charge to take actual courses. If you live within a certain distance of campus or you're an alum, there are cheaper ways of signing up. But first of all, I think all of us are well used. I think everyone is just serving on their share of panels and their conferences and webinars, so that you could spend the rest of your life watching, and most of them are recorded, etc. The Center for Israel Studies at American University has, first of all, we have a bank of webinars that we did on various subjects before October 7th, but guess what? There was a world and there were conflicts before that. And we have a series that we did on anti-Semitism and in various aspects of anti-Semitism in the world, and historians between the wars and the interwar period. We have, we're actually starting to plan a series on contemporary anti-Semitism for the fall, and that's going to be jointly sponsored by the Center for Israel Studies and Jewish Studies program. And then we also definitely have, we have every year, we plan a fall conference, and that is open to the public. We're just starting to plan it now. And that's through the Center for Israel Studies, so that's always Israel focused, and it's in person on campus at American University, but also in recent years we've been making it Zoomable, and then those panels are generally put on the web, so they are findable. And if you want more information about that, you're welcome to email me, anyone who's listening to this.
Absolutely, this is awesome. And again, the Gildenhorn Institute also has a YouTube channel. You can find all kinds of recordings from past events, webinars, conferences, and so on and so forth. Certainly, we have a variety of programs online and in person, and doors are open, either if it's a Zoom, if it's a webinar, and if it's here, just down the up in the second floor, you can certainly attend. There's also an auditing program that you can kind of register to. I don't know what the terms are financially or whatever in terms of residency requirements, but certainly that is also an option. And I'm very happy that we have this opportunity to kind of to focus on the regional dimension of the DMV or the kind of the metro area, the DC metro area. Alrighty, folks, we are out of time, and I think we answered all of the questions and raised a bunch of very interesting topics to think about and possibly have more events around. I'd like to thank Professor Ari Dubnov from GW University. I'd like to thank Lauren Strauss from American University. Thank you so much for the audience.
Thank
so
you,
much
Eli.
I would like to thank Eli Saltzman from UND.
Oh, thank you so much. I should have said my own thank yous, I guess, to myself. Alrighty, folks, have a good night. Stay
thanks
safe.
to everyone who was
Thank you so much.
online.
Take
Bye.
care. Be well.
Yeah.